A young, charismatic female entrepreneur heading a company valued at $9 billion in the heart of Silicon Valley. The promise of a medical advancement poised to change medical diagnosis forever. A fever dream with an incredibly rude awakening. This is the story of Theranos and its founder, Elizabeth Holmes. The once youngest self-made female billionaire now faces up to 20 years in prison. Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. My name is Laura and this is Culture Nonsense. Thank you for coming back if you're returning, and if you're new, welcome. Remember to hit that like and subscribe button if you enjoy this video and want to have more content. And also, if this is interesting to you, feel free to comment down below with more questions or suggestions. So today we're going to be talking about Theranos. And the reason we're bringing this up again is because the trial has just started this week. I don't know about any of you, but back in 2018, I could not get enough of the Theranos story. I read the book Bad Blood by Carreyrou. I watched all the documentaries, listened to a couple podcasts that were out there, a bunch of YouTube videos. Honestly, anything I could get my hands on, I devoured, and I was really obsessed with the story. And I think there are a lot of media sensational pieces like that we get really obsessed with. So it's kind of fun in an instance like this where there's a little bit of a renaissance of that obsession, because for those of you who don't know, Elizabeth Holmes, who was indicted back in 2018, began her trial this week, and it should last a little more than 3 months, and she's facing up to 20 years in prison. So I want to make this video about what new information we've found out recently, kind of leading up to the trial, and I might make a few more update videos as the trial goes on. Like I said, it should be a little more than 3 months. But for those of you who are not familiar with Theranos or Elizabeth Holmes, or were obsessed with the story back in the day, but it's been 3 years, I'm also going to give a little bit of an update of who she is, what Theranos is, what the scandal was, and what led us to this trial here. Also, if you are hearing about this for the first time and it seems really interesting, I'm going to link sources for, the book, documentary, podcast, so you can do your own deep dive of your choice. There's plenty of materials, but I think it's really interesting, and everything with the scandal, the deeper you go, the more there is. So what I'm going to describe is really just the tip of the iceberg. So like I said, if this is interesting and you haven't heard of it before, I'm going to link a bunch of stuff in the description that you should check out if you'd like. Okay, so at 19 years old, Elizabeth Holmes dropped out of Stanford, which was a really big deal. One of the podcasts about her is actually called The Dropout, and she founded a medical startup company called Theranos, which is the combination of the words therapy and diagnosis. So the company was trying to invent something that rightly would have rocked the medical world. Essentially, they were trying to be able to run over 200 different types of medical tests from a single drop or a couple drops of blood, as compared to doing an intravenous draw, which is longer. Usually you have to go to the doctor's office to do. So their proposed invention might have been in places like Walgreens stores. You could just stop in, get a little pinprick, send the sample off to the lab, and you would have the results for hundreds of tests, which would essentially be a cheaper, easier, and faster way to be able to diagnose people with medical problems. The thinking also being that if you have access to something that's so cheap and easy, you'll be able to find out earlier rather than later if you actually do have a potentially serious problem. Elizabeth usually used the example of her uncle who was diagnosed with cancer, and it's one of those things where they could have found out earlier if they'd done a blood test. So the thinking behind this invention is that it would promote people to go and get tested earlier and more often, and that you'd be able to potentially save a lot of lives. So it's really no wonder that an idea like this got a bunch of attention and over $700 million in investment money. People like Rupert Murdoch invested, Henry Kissinger and George Shultz, the former Secretary of State, were on the board. People like General Mad Dog Mattis were involved as well. So Elizabeth was really able to cultivate a bunch of really powerful figures around Theranos as well. So as time went on, Elizabeth was a little bit of a media darling. She did a ton of talks, interviews, there was a bunch of press about Theranos, and the company was valued at over $9 billion. And she was touted as the world's youngest self-made female billionaire because she had a 50% stake in the company. So she was essentially worth $4.5 billion. So she reached the height of her success and fame in 2015 until the truth about Theranos came out. So this scandal had to do with the fact that their invention really didn't work. Elizabeth knew this, or so the indictment claims, as do many of her previous employees. People had been trying to get the word out about the fact that the science wasn't there, their tests weren't working, there were quality control issues, but none of this was really paid attention to. Elizabeth kind of plowed on ahead regardless of all of these doubts and concerns from people who worked for her. In addition to this, a bunch of the prototypes of their machine, the Edison, were already out in Walgreens stores, so tens of thousands of people were receiving inaccurate and potentially dangerous medical results. And furthermore, anyone who tried to speak out against Elizabeth and the company was either fired or silenced. People had to sign NDAs when they started employment there and when they left. And Theranos was extremely litigious, so people were followed and threatened. And the whole story about reporting everything and how this came out in the book Bad Blood is actually really, really interesting. Theranos was one of those companies where you couldn't really question anything that Elizabeth said, and if you showed any defiance, you were kind of let go. It was a little bit of a cult-like atmosphere with her as the charismatic leader. So, like I said, in 2018, she was charged with actually 9 counts of wire fraud and 2 of conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and that's what the trial right now is about. We're really looking at the question, did Elizabeth knowingly defraud all of these people? Elizabeth was initially charged along with her ex-boyfriend and second in command, Ramesh Sunny Balwani. However, their trials were separated, so hers is taking place now and his is going to take place at some point in the future. So a couple of things that have happened since the indictment in 2018. Elizabeth actually got married in 2019 to Billy Evans, who is an MIT grad, about 8 years younger than her. Right now, I believe she's 37 and he's 29. And the couple recently had a baby. So a lot of people didn't realize that Elizabeth Holmes recently gave birth, and that's actually why her trial is right now. Her trial would have been much earlier, however, because of COVID-19, it was pushed back a couple of times, and then in the spring this year, she kind of shocked everyone when she announced that she was 5 months pregnant. Her trial would have started earlier in July, I believe. However, it was pushed back to now because she actually gave birth in July, so her baby's about 2 months old. So I don't want to get too involved in speculating over the motivations of her having a child during this time, although I will say that many outlets are talking about how interesting it is that she's chosen to give birth, and a lot of people think that it's because she's trying to soften up her image and appear more sympathetic to the jury. I don't know if she actually wanted to have a kid. I mean, she's getting up into her mid to late 30s, so maybe she was just really confident she could get off and she wanted to start a family. Who knows? Either way, it's a shame that this baby could grow up without a mother if she is sentenced. I will say that if having a child is more of a calculated decision on her part, it does kind of fit into other ways she's been trying to soften her image as well. Gone are her Steve Jobs-like black turtleneck, and she's also asked many times to be maskless in the trial, and this is something that, you know, any good defense team would probably want because you want to humanize your client, and if she were to appear without a mask, it would let the jurors see her face more, her expressions, how she reacts to things. So it's not really a surprise that she's requested to appear maskless, even though there's a mask mandate, and it appears that that request was not granted. And finally, earlier this week, there were some bombshell allegations that were dropped in terms of how the defense is actually going to approach her case. So according to Elizabeth, her ex-boyfriend of about a decade, I believe, Sunny Balwani was mentally and sexually abusive to her. So her defense is really going to center around her not being fully in control of her actions and decisions because she was so manipulated and controlled by him. This is obviously a huge claim, and she claims that he was monitoring her calls, what she could wear, how much she could eat, how much she could sleep, and insisting that any success she achieved was because of him. So Sunny is actually 19 years older than Elizabeth, and they did initially meet when she was 18, although it appears that they didn't start dating until a couple of years later. Even so, there are definitely a lot of power imbalances in a relationship like this when he was going out with someone who he had so much more life experience than. Many employees at Theranos also talked about Sunny's temper tantrums and how he would fly into rages and scream at people and disparage them. So I don't want to deny her claims of abuse because who knows, it's quite possible. However, I don't think that these claims would actually absolve her of any of the decision making in Theranos. I think that using this as a defense strategy is extremely risky. She's essentially claiming that she had such psychological pressure from Sunny that she was not in control of any decision making over her own company for a period of more than 5 years. It's really a big issue of the idea of the intent with the charges being brought against her. She's essentially saying she shouldn't be held liable because she wasn't in the right frame of mind to make any decisions about Theranos during this time. So Sunny has categorically denied these allegations, saying that they are deeply offensive to him, devastating personally, and highly unfair to his upcoming trial. Essentially, he's saying this is going to color anyone's opinions about him before his trial, so he's not going to get a fair one because of these allegations that have come out. Regardless if any abuse were present in their relationship, I think it's a pretty interesting defense strategy because it's essentially just shifting blame. I think so much evidence is against them. There was no way that they could actually try to deny anything. So they're not denying that Elizabeth did these things. They're just saying she shouldn't be held responsible for them. Their best chance isn't really to try to fight about the facts because the evidence looks so bad. They're just going to try to get the jury to sympathize with Elizabeth. It's not really a case they can win with a logical argument. They're just trying to get people to be more sympathetic to her, maybe get some of the jury to sway to her side and think that she shouldn't deserve to be convicted. It's also going to be difficult for the prosecution to touch this argument without looking like they're victim blaming. So in a way, it's a little bit smart, but like I said, a little bit odd that they're not really denying any of the things that Elizabeth did, just that she shouldn't be held responsible for her actions. Furthermore, there's a bunch of documentation that Elizabeth and Sunny disagreed on some things, and she pushed to be more unethical in some circumstances, or he tried to rein her in from ideas that he thought would be bad. So if these types of texts and emails, and they have tens of thousands of texts, by the way, if these are allowed into evidence in the trial, I think it would completely undermine this line of defense because there are concrete examples of Elizabeth and Sunny discussing some type of business strategy or lying to the press. And in all of these instances, it is Elizabeth who is pushing to do more unethical things. And like I said, sometimes Sunny is trying to hold her back from some of this stuff. So in all of their correspondence, it does not seem like they had the type of relationship where he had such a complete stranglehold over her and was in power of all of her decisions. At this point, these texts have not been allowed into evidence, but a lot of people have talked about the fact that they may be later in the trial. If they are, it would poke major holes in the defense's case. Speaking of trying to figure out what will be allowed in the trial, there have been a lot of instances of fighting over this. One particularly interesting example is witness testimonies of people who received inaccurate results from Theranos machines. Tens of thousands of people got negative or inaccurate results from Theranos machines, and a lot of these people are part of the prosecution's case. In fact, I believe they're calling over 200 witnesses total, and some of them are going to be people who received those results. However, there is a catch. They're going to be able to lay out what happened to them in terms of their diagnoses. However, they're not going to be able to really inject any emotion in it. They're not going to be able to talk about the emotional, financial, or physical toll these diagnoses had on them, which is interesting, but The prosecution thinks that the jury is really just going to be able to fill in the blanks. So, for example, there's a woman talking about how she struggled with infertility. She was pregnant, had a blood test from one of these machines, and it told her that she had miscarried. Now, she actually didn't. She still had a viable pregnancy and she was eventually able to carry it to term. However, if you've struggled with infertility and you're told again that you've miscarried, that could be very harmful, damaging emotionally. Who knows if she would have done something that could have damaged the viability of the pregnancy because she thought she already lost it. For example, another woman was incorrectly diagnosed with AIDS. I don't know what that would have been like for her. There's even a further example of a man who was improperly diagnosed, and this potentially could have led to a heart attack and his death. So all of these examples, even if you just say exactly what happened, I think the jury is going to be able to see that there are so many negative ramifications from these inaccurate tests. Even if you just take the emotionality out of it, I think they're going to be able to see how damaging this was to victims of Theranos. All in all, Theranos was forced to void or correct nearly 1 million tests. I've given you just a few examples of how these results were potentially damaging or dangerous. And I could honestly just do a whole episode about all of these instances of what happened with these negative tests. In response to this testimony, the defense is most likely going to say that you can't cherry pick a few bad examples and that all labs make a number of mistakes and you're going to have to look at the data set of a whole to really make a judgment about how good Theranos was at providing results to patients. In my opinion, 1 million voided tests isn't really cherry picking, but what do I know? I'm not a lawyer. This argument actually leads to a bigger problem though. They can't look at the entire data set because it is missing. Not only that, it was actually destroyed by Theranos. On June 4th, 2018, Theranos was subpoenaed and they were asked to hand over the data set to the government, and they complied with this about 2.5 months later. They gave them an encrypted hard drive which needed 2 passwords to open. However, one of the passwords was missing. So it took the government a while to realize that they needed this extra password, and during that span of time, the original data set was being dismantled because Theranos was shutting down. So by the time they realized they needed this other password, the original data set was gone and the password was never recovered. So we actually don't have the entire data set for all of the tests that Theranos ran. I believe this covered a time span of over 3 years. So because that data set is missing, the defense is going to claim that it's actually the government's fault. They're essentially going to lean into the storyline that it could have proved Elizabeth's innocence. And I mean, why not if the data set is gone and you're never going to recover it? However, I don't quite buy this because we have documentation that during this time there were a couple employees at Theranos who knew about the missing password and never told anyone from the government about it. So if this was potentially going to exonerate them and their company, why wouldn't they have told someone about the missing password for a crucial piece of evidence? So there's no direct evidence that Elizabeth was really involved at all in the destruction of this data set. So it can't actually be brought up in trial by the prosecution unless the defense brings it up first. Basically, if they slip up and say something as simple as, "We don't have the data to prove this," that opens the door for the prosecution to talk about the missing data set and say, "Oh, well, you essentially caused this data to be lost and or destroyed. What are you trying to hide?" It will be really interesting to see if this data set stays out of the trial or if anyone slips up and it's introduced into evidence that the jury can see, because it seems really shady. So the last thing that I want to talk about are some things that have happened with the jury and a couple quotes from the opening statements that were today. Earlier in the week, we had jury selection, and the final jury is 7 men and 5 women. They range in ages from 19 to in their 60s. And there's actually an issue with the 19-year-old juror. Apparently I believe it's a she, is having issues with her work. Since the trial is supposed to last more than 3 months, her manager isn't going to pay her for that time. So she says that she might not be able to sit on the trial because she has to make an income to support her mother. So I think the judge is going to try to talk to her employer, see if they can switch around her shifts to night shifts or work something out, but she may actually be replaced with one of the 5 alternates that's also on this case. And finally, I just want to quote a couple things that have been said in the opening statements today, because the opening statements are kind of a roadmap for the type of things that the defense and the prosecution are going to lay out in their case. There's also a lot of buzz about Elizabeth Holmes testifying, which seems likely, which will be really interesting as well, because we're going to be able to hear all of those abuse allegations directly from her, but she's also going to open herself up to cross-examination if that happens. So I'm really excited for this possibility. Okay, so the prosecutor that gave the opening statement today is Robert Leach. One of the things that he said is this case is all about lying and cheating to get money. So very clear where they stand. He paints a picture of Elizabeth kind of running out of time and money in 2009 with her company, and basically she decided to cheat and lie to people instead to keep the sham going. He says, and I quote, "The defendant's fraudulent scheme made her a billionaire. The scheme brought her fame, it brought her honor, and it brought her adoration. She had become, as she sought, one of the most celebrated CEOs in Silicon Valley and the world, but under the facade of Theranos' success, there were significant problems brewing." Apparently, at one point, he showed jurors an excerpt of a Theranos presentation to investors, which apparently claimed that they had the highest levels of accuracy and precision, which is the farthest thing from the truth. So that's an example of a downright lie to investors. And he talks about how insiders knew that the technology was consistently plagued by problems and that it repeatedly failed quality control. Finally, he lays out a bunch of ways that Elizabeth Holmes defrauded her investors, including suggesting that the company's mini lab was vetted by Pfizer, which it was not, that this technology was going to be used in the US military field, again, was not, and that it would achieve more than $140 million in revenue by the end of 2014, which is nowhere near to being possible. So those are some of the claims laid out by the prosecution, and this is what the defense had to say in response. Again, it seems like the defense is honestly just saying that Elizabeth isn't to blame for all the things that went on. The defense attorney Lance Wade says, "Theranos failed for a lot of reasons. It failed in part because it made mistakes. Mistakes are not crimes. A failed business does not make a CEO a criminal. It is not a crime to believe your own hype. It's not a crime to be overconfident in your company. It is a crime to knowingly deceive people. And prosecutors will have to prove that that's what Elizabeth Holmes did." This question about overhyping yourself is also really interesting and has been talked a lot about in the context of Theranos, because that happens all the time in Silicon Valley. They talk about puffery, kind of playing up your own company until you can actually get to the level that you were pretending to be at all along. Fake it until you make it, essentially. That's really different in a tech company versus a medical company where you were already giving people false results and potentially putting them in extreme danger. Back to what Mr. Wade has to say. "In the end, Theranos failed and Ms. Holmes walked away with nothing. But failure is not a crime. Trying your hardest and coming up short is not a crime. And by the time this trial is over, you will see that the villain the government just presented is actually a living, breathing human being who did her very best each and every day. And she is innocent. We'll see about that." Like I said, their strategy just really seems to be to humanize her and say that she didn't know what she was doing. Yes, things got bad, but it's really not her fault. And again, just try to make someone in the jury sympathetic enough to let her off. So that's it for today. Like I said, if you want to know more, there's going to be a bunch of information in the description. Thank you for watching. Let me know if you want more updates, because I would definitely like to make more. Comment if you have any questions, like and subscribe, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye.